something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Before the main discussion today, I want to thank all of our Patreon subscribers for their support. If it weren't for all of you, we would not be able to do this. If you are not a subscriber, you are missing out on hundreds of hours of content which illuminate the organized criminal entity that is the U.S. Empire. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. James DiEugenio, it's great to be back with you.
Nice to be here, Aaron.
You have been writing of late about JFK, because you're, of course, known as one of the top authorities on the JFK assassination, and you've been writing about JFK and his policies in the Middle East, which are extremely relevant and pretty much lead directly to where we are now, or I should say the reversal of JFK's policies have brought us to this horrific moment that we're witnessing. How would you say that your views of JFK and the Middle East have evolved over the years? Because this is something probably only in the last 10 years you've gone back to look more closely at, but I think that you've done good work here. And what's your perspective on this now in 2025?
Well, I've written my series on the debacle in the Middle East versus JFK. That's been completed. That's in 5 parts on my Substack, James Anthony DiEugenio. And there's a sequel to it called Israel Attacks America, the Liberty Incident, which I've done 2 installments on, and that will be 4 or 5 total also. With what's happening in the Middle East today, I don't think any rational, objective person could condone what America is backing at that place right now. I think it's a horrific atrocity, all right? And I think that first Biden and then Trump has more or less given free, a free ride to a guy who I believe is one of the worst leaders, not just of Israel, but of any country in the world today, which of course is Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay? All right? I think that by doing this, the United States has really kind of abandoned its traditional role of being an equal arbiter for both sides. All right. And by the way, this is completely nonpartisan because Biden was just as bad on this as Trump is right now. All right. Trump has an excuse, of course. It's pretty tough to say no to $100 million, that Miriam Adelson gave to his campaign. All right. But this has gotten so bad that I decided, well, I think the time is ripe for bringing up a parallel and putting it into historical context. That is, JFK's policies in the Middle East and how they more or less followed the tradition that Eisenhower had begun. All right. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the Suez Crisis. All right. In 1956, Israel, France, and England decided to launch a massive invasion of Egypt. All right. The casus belli for this was the takeover of the Suez Canal by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt. He had offered to pay for the canal. All right. But they wouldn't even talk about that. And so they planned this 3-part invasion of Egypt. And the first strike was by the Israelis across the Sinai. They landed paratroopers. All right. It was to be followed by a big air attack. All right. By England and a naval attack by France. Now, Anthony Eden, the leader of Great Britain at that time, was, and I'm not exaggerating very much at all, he was obsessed with Nasser, all right, for a lot of different reasons. You know, one being that Egypt had more or less been a protectorate of the United Kingdom for a while, all right. Nasser had overthrown the monarchy, all right, and now he had this movement called the Free Officers Movement, which was going to modernize and decolonize the rest of the Middle East. That was his ultimate ambition. He was a pan-Arabist. And so Nasser was, in the eyes of Anthony Eden, you know, because Britain was the great colonizer, all right, he was going to go ahead and destabilize this whole colonial relationship that Europe had with the third world. And to give you an example, John Foster Dulles, of course, was reading the world at that time with these alliances. You know, like there was SEATO in the Far East, and he wanted to make one up for the Middle East, originally called the Baghdad Pact, later called CENTO. All right, and he wanted Nasser to join. All right, and Nasser turned him down flat. He goes, look, everybody knows that England will be a silent partner to this thing. They're the greatest colonizers on earth. If I join this Baghdad Pact, I'll lose all my stature, you know, to my populace in Egypt. I'll be looking like a British lackey. All right. And so he turned it down. It's another thing that angered, okay, the British. And in fact, when he formed this thing, Britain was actually a formal partner. All right. Now, the other thing that motivated this was that Nasser turned down, well, he didn't actually, Dulles reneged on an arrangement that the United States was going to lend money for the Aswan Dam. All right. This really infuriated Nasser. And Nasser always thought that it was because of his refusal to join the Baghdad Pact, plus his recognition of Red China. Right. And so this is one of the reasons that he decided to take possession of the Suez Canal. And that, of course, provoked this assault. Now, there was one problem. the conspirators did not keep Eisenhower informed. All right.
Probably for good reason, right? I mean, they wouldn't have persuaded him. So it was more like ask forgiveness rather than permission, something like that.
And so when Dulles found out about this, okay, he told Eisenhower, and Eisenhower was pretty upset about the whole thing. All right. And he decided that he and Foster Dulles decided, no, this is not going to fly. All right. We're going to do everything we can to thwart this thing. And they did. They sent Dulles to the UN to get a resolution condemning the invasion. All right. And Dulles was very effective because he took it to the General Assembly, which included a lot of the former third world countries, and they voted for it. All right. And Eisenhower made it clear that he firmly objected to what these guys were doing. Okay. And it was more or less stopped after about 6 days. All right. Now, it's what Eisenhower did after that set a precedent that is going to be overturned by Lyndon Johnson. All right. Eisenhower insisted that the Israelis had to get out of the areas that they had invaded. All right. This included the Sinai Desert. All right. And he made it clear that he would take action. He would cancel loans. He would put economic sanctions on Israel if they did not get out. Now, let me add a sidelight to this that's very important. Lyndon Johnson got on the phone with Abba Eban, all right, one of the top leaders of the fledgling Israeli state, and told him that he objected to what Eisenhower was doing. At that, remember, it's 1956. All right. All right. And of course, Johnson was a Senate Majority Leader. All right. And he promised Abba Eban that Johnson would not cooperate with this, which he did not. So Eisenhower basically had to go ahead and proceed against Israel on his own. See, what this was a part of was another precedent called the Tripartite Agreement, which I think was 1950. And the Tripartite Agreement essentially said that no one country in the Middle East should attack another country in the Middle East or take control of any of its territories, right? And I believe that France, England, and the United States all signed on to that, all right? Kennedy is going to mention it more than once in his communications with the Israelis, all right? So under this kind of pressure, Israel did get out, okay? And Kennedy, you know, who disagreed with Eisenhower on a lot of things, all right, he took this as being a positive precedent, all right? It was an upholding of the Tripartite Agreement, all right, which he firmly backed, all right? So then, and the reason I'm laying this background in, I think it's important to understand what a reversal that Johnson is going to do, okay? Because This was the established precedent, all right, upheld by the Tripartite Agreement, upheld by Eisenhower and Dulles, and stood by JFK. So this
and
is
also in agreement with the UN Charter as well, and
yeah, it had all kinds of legal backing, all right, going back to 1950, you know? And so LBJ in 1967 is going to go ahead and reverse 17 years of precedent in the Middle East. Now, let's understand a little bit about, before we get into the whole 1967 thing, let's understand a little bit about Kennedy in the Middle East. All right. It's not, see, the other things that Kennedy was doing in foreign policy, like Southeast Asia and Cuba, okay, and Indonesia and Congo, they usually get a lot of attention by historians, all right, and sometimes in the media. His Middle East policy, I thought, was relatively ignored. I don't know for what reason, okay, but that's been the case. So I decided maybe it's time to take a look at this, in also in opposition to what's going on there now. And as
you wrote an article too about maybe 10 years ago in
yes,
maybe Covert Action magazine or in Garrison, I can't remember where, but you wrote an article that dealt with a lot of this
it was in Garrison.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. See, Kennedy had visited Palestine in 1939. All right, and he wrote a remarkable letter. I mean, for a 21-year-old young man to have written a letter like this to his father, his observations about what was going on in Palestine at that time. Remember, this is 1939. This is when it's under the British mandate. Okay, all right. He said that it appears that most of the people don't like what the Zionist Jews are doing there, okay? They seem to be seeking no compromise, and they set fires and explosions in their own areas, calling the British to come in and stop the flames the next day. In other words, they were trying to destabilize the situation already. All right. Okay. And Kennedy said, it appears to me that they believe that this is their country, that this is going to be the land of milk and honey for these Jewish expatriates at this time. You know, unfortunately, they don't have very much backing from the nearby community, which perceives it as being staunchly Arab, because they've been there for the last few hundred years. All right, it's really an interesting letter that shows you how perceptive Kennedy is as a 21-year-old young man about international affairs. And so in my article, I said, I don't think you can understand what Kennedy was doing, okay, when he becomes president, unless you read and understand that letter. All right. So that was sort of like my jumping off point. See, Kennedy had, and I have to give credit to Monica Wisak, okay, who's written a lot about this issue, all right, in both of her books. She wrote one book about, I think it's called America's Last President, all right, about Kennedy's presidency. And she wrote another book which I can't recall the title of
It's
now.
Echoes of a Lost America. Because I
Yeah,
interviewed
that's
her
it.
about each of those.
That's it. Echoes of Lost America, and she wrote about it there also. There were 4 prominent areas of dispute between Kennedy and at that time David Ben-Gurion, who was the president of Israel. Golda Meir, I believe, was a foreign minister. All right. And I think Abba Eban might have been the ambassador to the UN. All right. And these 4 were number 1, Nasser, number 2, Palestinian repatriation, number 3, the American Zionist Council, and number 4, the Dimona reactor. All right. These are all very contested disputes between the White House and Tel Aviv at that time. All right.
For good reason, because they all have enormous historical impacts the way they get resolved.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, they do. Now, very briefly, the dispute between the AZC and the Kennedy White House was that they should have to register under the Foreign Agent Act because they were, in fact, lobbying for Israel. Okay? So that's what they should have to do, even though they were based in the United States. And Bobby Kennedy made a recommendation to that effect. All right? Well, the AZC, to put it mildly, didn't like it. And in fact, one of the reasons they didn't like it is really very interesting, is that if you do this to us, this is essentially what they said. If you do this to us, it will confirm all the criticism that our rival group, which I think was the World Judaism Council or something like that.
Yeah, like an anti-Zionist group, right?
And yeah, that was the point they were
just
making.
Like righteous anti-Zionist Jews. They were, in retrospect, they seemed very like decent, like a decent group of people.
Right. And so this is the plea that they put before the Justice Department. Can you imagine saying something like that? Well, wait a minute. This will prove all of our enemies are saying is right.
Right.
And so
it's ridiculous.
And so they dilly-dallied around, and the Justice Department said, look, we want you to produce all your receipts, okay, all your purchases, etc. All right, all the internal accounting, and then we'll make a decision based upon that information. Well, to put it mildly, they didn't want to do it. This is in October of 1963. All right. And so what they did is they began a fallback position. The fallback position was the organization of a new group called IPAC. Okay. Just in case the door got slammed on the AZC. All right. Well, of course, what happened is that when Kennedy was killed, the whole thing was more or less dropped, and Johnson actually gave a tax-exempt free ride to IPAC back, knowing that they were the same thing, back to 1953. All right? So this is one reversal. Secondly, Kennedy backed something called the Joseph Johnson Plan. All right, the Joseph Johnson Plan, he had been working for the UN, all right, and he had devised a plan to, what it did is it tried to ameliorate the refugee problem from the Nakba, okay, where the Israelis essentially taken
terrorized. Yeah, they committed essentially genocidal acts, massacres. To remove
right.
people.
Yeah, the
It probably
Dayer,
should be considered a case of genocide. Genocidal crimes.
something called Dayer Yassin is a good example. If you take a look you can look that up on Google, and it was a massacre of at least 100 Palestinians. It was a terror campaign to get the Palestinians out of the area. Okay, that the Israeli Zionist movement was going to claim. And by the way, that Dayer Yassin, that's not the only one. There was more than one of those massacres, and they've been covered up by Israeli official historians. All right, there's one guy. I think his name is Pape, P-A-P-P.
Elon Pape.
Yeah, he's pretty good on this. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. He can tell you all about it. All right. Now, Johnson had given up on his plan. All right. He didn't think that he could get it through.
Johnson, the UN.
Yeah, Joseph Johnson.
Was he the ambassador, or was he just a special envoy for this particular
No, I think
issue?
he was a special envoy.
Okay.
And so Kennedy decided he was going to pursue it anyway. All right. Except he was going to pursue it in a bilateral effect. Okay. He was going to go ahead and do it himself by negotiations with the Israelis. All right. And to his credit, he never gave up on this until the end, until his assassination. All right. See, Johnson said that what was so anathema to the Israelis was the option that some of the Palestinians could choose to go back to where they were from. But he had concluded...
To the homes, to like their homes that Israel stole.
Right.
Such.
But he had concluded that his work predicted that only about 10% would choose that option. Okay, that they would rather stay where they were or repatriate somewhere else because those would be paid for. All right. Supposed to be paid by the UN, but it's actually going to be paid for by the United States. All right. And so...
And some of them would presumably settle in the Palestinian territories. Yes. Correct. And then which also, to me, when you get into all of this, the real issue is whether it's Ben-Gurion or anyone else, that if you look at Ben-Gurion's actions and his communications to his supporters and everything else, and didn't Ben-Gurion say in one of these communications that the Joe Johnson plan would have been like this terrible blow to Israel and so on?
Yes, yes.
And this, to me, despite the Likud versus Labor or whatever, I think Ben-Gurion and pretty much most of these prominent people always wanted greater Israel. That's if you think that and then you try to work that out with whatever piece of information you're looking at about the conduct of people like Ben-Gurion and so on, it seems to be the clearest explanation that they really wanted to either stall or do anything to make sure that they could eventually get to be able to steal the rest of Palestine. It's called
Eretz Israel.
Yeah.
That's the term that they use. Translated, it's Greater Israel. And you're exactly right that Ben-Gurion mightily resisted. You see, there was like I don't want to call it a conspiracy, but there was like a internal agreement among the upper level of the Israelis. Look, let's talk to Kennedy. Let's listen to him. Let's make like we can be reasonable, but we're not going to give in on any of this stuff at the end. Okay, so that was, and essentially that's what they repeat
that.
Say.
They repeat that in the 90s.
Yes, yes.
They repeat that in the 90s. They probably had a big hand in getting rid of George H.W. Bush. At least that's what I'm told by people who know people in the family, which is why W. Bush went so far the other direction. So he was undone by Israel in his own different way.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, in the, I think you're referring to this one statement. In reality, Ben-Gurion was never going to admit one single Palestinian to let go back to their homeland. That's what his stand was. We'll fight that. He basically said, we'll fight this to the last man. Now, of course, he's not going to tell Kennedy that. And when Kennedy brings it up with Golda Meir, you know, she has a dispute over numbers. Okay. She tries to make this a number issue. Well, how many do you want us to take, etc.? Okay. Do you want us to take 10? Do you want us to take 50? Do you want us to take 1,000, etc.? And so that became the debate. But that was really a diversion because they had no intention of ever taking any of them. Okay. You know, all right. Now, I think any rational person would say that the Johnson plan was a reasonable solution to the Palestinian refugee problem. Okay, I really think that it was a kind of ingenious and inventive way to solve a very serious problem at that time. But the Israelis...
It's still unfair to the Palestinians, by the way. I mean, when it comes down to it, there's no set of principles or body of international law that can be used to rationalize or justify 1948. So even the Johnson plan was much more charitable than the Zionists deserved based on what they had done in terms of any concept of international law, etc.
Well, but the thing you have to understand is that once Truman recognized Israel, okay,
after that with a lot of money, but that changed hands too.
You know, well, let's not forget the letter bombs either. Okay, all right, because there's two credible reports that there were letter bombs being sent to the White House at that time. You know, one by his daughter, one by the mail depot guy. All right, so it was both a carrot and a stick approach they were using for Truman. All right, and by the way, I should say that after that, you know, Truman wasn't really all that friendly with Israel. Okay, and neither was Eisenhower. All right, but getting back to Kennedy, all right, he never stopped pushing for this. Again, this was all but abandoned once LBJ came into office. There was really never any even serious discussion about this. Whereas, for example, Kennedy, I think his last meeting with Golda Meir, he said this was one of the problems that he had with Israel. See, when you utterly reject something like the Johnson plan, you know, what am I supposed to say to the Arabs? Okay? Because at that time, you know, pre-LBJ, you know, Kennedy was still trying to play both sides, you know, the Arabs and the Israelis. All right. He didn't think that the United States should go all in on either side. All right. Okay. Now, then there was Dimona, all right, which I don't think we have to talk about very much. I think most of your listeners will know what this was all about. You know, the secret building.
Right. The nuclear program and the NUMEC in Pennsylvania, where they essentially stole the...
Right. But they actually stole the highly enriched uranium, you know, from a plant in Pittsburgh that Glenn Seaborg, who was the Atomic Energy Commissioner, so stupidly let... And let's be frank about this, you know, in this day and age. After the book by Roger Mattson, and I think there's another book on it called Divert. I don't remember who the author of that is, but there's two books on this. You know, I don't think there's really any question that NUMEC was a Mossad front Okay. And it was created, I believe, for this precise embezzlement, of highly enriched uranium to Israel. All right. And it's really a bloody shame that this was allowed to proceed as it did. And in Roger Mattson's book, which I believe is called Stealing the Atom Bomb, all right, he is very critical of Glenn Seaborg, for allowing this to go ahead as it did. And he exposes how long it took, all right, to get to the bottom of this. I don't think it happened until under Carter, where the FBI finally did an investigation in which they interviewed people who worked at that plant. It was north of Pittsburgh in a little town called Apollo. Okay, and the name of the plant was NUMEC, which was an acronym. All right, and they interviewed, I believe, 4 witnesses who worked there, who said that late at night there was a truck that would arrive. All right, and in the back of the truck they would deposit a package, the destination being Israel. Now here's my question. How could an American nuclear processing plant be sending highly enriched uranium to Israel? Okay, for what purpose could that be? There's only one purpose, all right, and that's and Carl Duckett, who was the technical expert for the CIA, when he examined the sample from the Dimona area, the Negev Desert, he told Richard Helms, this came from the United States. Okay? This highly enriched, this came from the United States. They have the bomb. All right? And Helms goes in and I think this was in early 68. Helms goes in and tells Johnson, all right, it looks like Israel has the bomb. And you know what Johnson said? This is how Mattson begins his book. Okay, this conference between Helms and LBJ. Helms walking in and telling Johnson, Israel has the bomb. He says, don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
Can you imagine this? I mean, can you imagine this? Not wanting to tell the Defense Department, not wanting to tell the State Department that there's a new member of the Atomic Club. All right. And we helped give him this stuff. I mean, this is how in bed that Johnson was with Israel. All right. It lost all, and remember, Kennedy is going to the mat about Dimona. He's demanding biannual inspections on his terms. All right.
Yeah, LBJ totally reverses that. He also drastically reduces the amount of FBI wiretapping and so on syndicate figures and so on. He reverses everything that Kennedy was doing in all of these areas.
So,
and this is a part of it, by the way. When you're talking about NUMEC and Angleton likely facilitating some of this in the nuclear bomb issue, there's the other issue of Lansky and the Vegas set, and Lansky is very close to Mossad, even to the point that he flees there when he's being finally indicted. He was never wiretapped. He and Marcello and Traficante were never wiretapped, the top 3 guys who were the most involved in the drug traffic. And he flees to Israel. He eventually comes back once Nixon is more or less, neutered by Watergate. There's letters at the end of his life, like 1980. I found a letter that was written to the guy that used to be the head of Ben Gurion's security detail, and he was a high-ranking Mossad officer, and he was asking about if he'd been lobbying for him to come back so he could make another visit to Israel. So this is, Johnson turns a blind eye, stops the investigations into the syndicate and into and RFK's fixation on the Las Vegas and all that. and he reverses all the scrutiny of the nuclear issue. The American Zionist Council effort is reversed, and of course, the 6-Day War is the ultimate, coup for Israel under LBJ.
So Kennedy, and I believe this is June of 1963. Kennedy finally says, all right, if this is the way you're going to play, I'm going to pull all funding for Israel. All right. He was the first and last president to ever threaten something like that. All right. And so one day after that letter arrives at the embassy, Ben-Gurion resigns. All right. And some people, I think Monica believes this, and I think Rick Sterling, who co-wrote a book on this subject with really a compendium of documents on it, they believe this was a stall, that Ben-Gurion did this so that Kennedy would have to allow more time, for Levi Eshkol. And he's the new prime minister. And by the way, comparatively speaking, and let me underline that, comparatively speaking, Eshkol was really a moderate compared to what's going to come after him. All right. So Eshkol takes office and he agrees. And at the time of Kennedy's death, McGeorge Bundy is sorting out a schedule for these visits to Dimona. Now, this is another policy that's going to be completely, because Kennedy insisted that they be biannual and they would be comprehensive, and that the Israelis would not be able to limit, any investigations that he was going to, didn't happen. Under Johnson, they were once a year. It was at the Israelis' dispense, and they were allowed to be guides to what they were allowed to see. Now, I'm sure that you and most of your viewers will understand that this got so ridiculous that the Israelis set up a whole dummy Dimona, a fake Dimona, all right, in order so they wouldn't have to reveal, what they were in reality doing. And at the same time that the Israelis are creating this atomic bomb capability, they're experimenting with the so-called Jericho missile, all right, so they can actually deliver these atomic bombs over hundreds of miles by missile instead of doing it by jet bomber. Okay. All right. And so here's another reversal of Kennedy's policy by Johnson. Now, the fourth problem that Kennedy had with Israel was his attempt to establish a relationship with Nasser of Egypt. Now, why was Kennedy interested in doing such a thing? First of all, Nasser was a socialist. He wanted to advance the lives of the people under him. All right. He wasn't a royalist in Saudi Arabia. All right.
He wanted to make Egypt and the Egyptian political regime work on behalf of the Egyptian nation, and a broader conception of nationalism that went across, the Middle East and the Arab world, and that's of course Pan-Arabism. And at one point, there is a republic, with the United Arab Republic
with Syria.
Included Syria and then Yemen, parts of Yemen for
he got into a war with Saudi Arabia,
right,
over Yemen. a war of succession. All right, because Yemen had been overthrown by the Free Officers Movement, and Saudi Arabia didn't like that, okay?
Right.
Because they knew what Nasser had in mind. Because Nasser believed that all the oil under the ground in the Middle East belonged to all the Arabs, okay? And his goal was to use that money to construct roads and highways and schools and universities and hospitals, etc., to bring them out of this kind of, Middle Ages kind of feudalistic setup. All right.
Neocolonial dominance,
Right.
Basically that the Middle East would be controlled by the people of the Middle East, not by puppet regimes.
Right. That was
these crazy white people who took over Palestine as well.
Yeah. But he was also opposed to Saudi Arabia.
Right. Because they were the puppets.
Yeah. So that's one reason. The second reason is he was a secularist. He was not an Islamic fundamentalist. All right.
He made fun of them even.
Yes. There's a great YouTube video of Nasser addressing his Congress in which he says, I tried to negotiate with the Muslim Brotherhood, all right? And I actually called in the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is this radicalist terrorist group that was under the control of Saudi Arabia, who tried
originally founded by the Suez
British
Canal Company.
Yeah, by the British, yeah.
The Brits.
All right. And so he called in the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he actually tried to negotiate. And he said the first thing the guy said, this is what we want. You have to tell everyone to wear the hijab.
All the women.
And the women have to wear a tiara. And so, so Nasser looks at this guy and he says, you want me to order every woman in Egypt to wear, do you know how many, that's millions of women to wear. You can't even get your own daughter to wear it. She's going to a medical school at university and she won't, and you want me to order millions of women and everybody in the place cracks up. And by the way, if you watch that video, nobody is wearing that. All these guys are in suits, okay, including Nasser. All right. And so this was what Kennedy saw as a bridge to the future.
Yeah, progress.
Yes. Okay. And that he could influence the Middle East through Nasser, because number three is that Nasser was a pan-Arabist. All right. As you mentioned, he had a temporary union with Syria called the United Arab Republic. All right. Which, from what I've read, was busted up by Saudi Arabia. See, Saudi Arabia and Egypt were at loggerheads, okay? All right, because there was no way Saudi Arabia was going to give up all the money it had, okay, due to its oil deposits, all right, and the deal they had.
Probably, realistically, it wasn't just, let's make a bunch of money. There's another side to that equation, which is if they were to go against the West, who knows what the MI6, Mossad, CIA would do if they took a nationalist turn. I mean, they knew what happened to Mossadegh.
Right. And so Kennedy saw Nasser as the future. He saw Saudi Arabia as the past. All right. And in fact, even when the king of Saudi Arabia, I believe, was at a hospital, I think in the Palm Beach area down in Florida, the State Department had to tell Kennedy to go see him. He didn't want to go. All right. And on the way over, his driver said, Kennedy kept on muttering, "What am I doing visiting this guy?" All right. And so, see, Foster Dulles had turned to Saudi Arabia as a counterweight against Nasser because they thought, because Nasser had been to the 1955 Bandung Conference in Indonesia, all right, which was the beginning of the non-aligned movement, all right, and Nasser was there, and I believe the second conference was in Cairo. So Dulles did not like, to put it mildly, did not like the non-aligned movement, all right, because coming from where he was at Sullivan and Cromwell, you know, he had all these businesses which were controlling all these areas in the colonized world that was making millions, you know, for these corporations that he and his brother represented.
Right.
All
Wall
right.
Street believed that American corporations should own the valuable resources in countries around the world, and this was
That's
how
correct.
colonialism had essentially functioned. And the outcome was to impoverish people and to weaken them as states, and really not to even give them control of their own destiny and their own territory.
Right. Right. Kennedy thought that Nasser could represent a future for the Middle East. All right. And so these are the reasons that he decided to try and forge this relationship with Nasser, which Ben Gurion really did not like. I mean, when I say really did not like, I mean, that's putting it mildly. I mean, he was in these letters to Kennedy, he's comparing Nasser to Hitler. Okay, saying if Nasser ever had the opportunity, if Nasser ever had the weaponry, he would do to us what the Nazis did, you know, back in the 30s and 40s and all this stuff, you know. And Kennedy would take this with a giant grain of salt, okay, and he would try and get back to the topic at hand, all right. And by the way, he would tell Nasser a lot of this stuff, all right. Okay, so these are the four areas of dispute that Kennedy had with the Tel Aviv government at that time. All right. Now, as I mentioned in my article, my series of Substack articles, these all magically went away once Kennedy was killed. In fact, Nasser, within 6 months, noted that there's going to be a change of policy under Johnson. He's going to favor Tel Aviv, all right? And which, of course, is absolutely true, all right? And this was marked by the fact that Johnson was the first American president to send offensive weapons to Israel. I believe it was in 1966. He sent $92 million worth of weaponry, including tanks and jet planes, to Israel. Now remember, this is 66. That's the equivalent of close to $1 billion in weaponry today. All right. And this was really the beginning. And of course, these were used during the 6-Day War.
Yeah, it's very shortly before that he sends this weapon.
Yes.
I mean,
and in fact, right before the 6-Day War broke out, Johnson authorized, I believe it was 2 weeks before, he authorized an emergency shipment. Now remember, this is before the war has broken out. He authorizes an emergency shipment to Israel, spare parts for planes and tanks. Now, how did he know that they were going to need these spare parts unless he knew that there was an attack coming up? All right.
That's he also asked the CIA for to perform an estimate on what the result would be.
And
it would take about a week for the Israelis to win with the advantages that they have.
But then he wanted supplementary reports from the State Department and the NSA. Okay. So he had 3 reports on his desk prior to the breakout of the war. But here's the capper about that. In my articles, I note the person who I considered the Miriam Adelson of the Johnson administration, which was a woman named Matilda Krim. Matilda Krim was born in Europe. Her first husband was a member of, I believe, the Irgun. There were two Jewish terrorist gangs, Irgun and Stern. Okay, I think he was a member of Irgun. She participated in some of these activities through him. I think his name was David Dian or something like that. All right. And she was indoctrinated with this radical Zionist philosophy. They divorced, and she married a guy named Arthur Krim. Arthur Krim was a high-powered Beverly Hills entertainment law attorney. Okay, who I think actually Arthur Krim ended up running a studio, one of the smaller studios in I think it was Orion, okay, in Hollywood. And I think that's what he was doing at the time of the Johnson administration. Matilda and Arthur Krim, you know how close they were to LBJ? They had a room in the White House, and they built a house that was a helicopter jump ride away from his ranch down in Texas. New Year's Eve, 1968, they're celebrating New Year. And remember, this is when, by this time, Johnson is hated. Can't even go anywhere because there's too many rioting students, you know, chanting, "How many kids did you kill today, LBJ?" Okay, he can't even go anywhere. He can only go to defense plants or military bases. They're celebrating New Year's Eve with him at his ranch in Texas in January 1st, 1968, December 31st, actually. All right, that's how close they were to Johnson. Arthur Krim. Arthur Krim, I don't know how he did this, probably from his friends in Israel. He monitored that emergency shipment that Johnson had sent over the last week of May. All right. And he told Johnson, you better expedite it. All right. You better get it there faster. That's how plugged in they were to Johnson's. Matilda Krim was writing him memos during the 6-Day War. Can you imagine Kennedy allowing something like this? Okay. You know, I sure can't. All right. But that is how close that Matilda and Arthur Krim, you know, the staunch Zionists, you know, I guess the only, you know, they were kind of radical, if you ask me. You know,
ultra Zionists who were obsessed with Greater Israel.
And can you imagine them influencing policy like that? I mean, that is, and by the way, one last thing about that.
It's like George W. Bush. You'd have to go. That's the administration. But really, I think Clinton was also kind of. I mean, presidents just seem to get worse in this regard.
Yeah,
over time. But Johnson was ahead of his time there. I mean, no doubt about it. Very much different from even Truman was not as like crazily Zionist as this. But he had, you know, and JFK and Eisenhower definitely had a different perspective on this.
Johnson's speech after the 6-Day War, he ran it by the Krims. This is how much influence. Okay, that Matilda and Arthur Krim had on Johnson's policy in the Middle East towards Israel. So what I'm trying to say here is that in each of these instances, Johnson broke with Kennedy. In each of these instances, what he did was, in essence, to form a new paradigm for the relationship with Israel. That did not exist prior Okay, and in fact, every writer you will read on this issue, okay, will tell you that Johnson set a new plateau, okay, in America. He was, at that time, he was the best friend that Israel ever had, okay, in the White House. And if you ask me, none of the presidents before him even came close to what Johnson did. Now, how do we explain this? Well, I did some background work on this. Coming up in his career in Texas, he was very good friends with a guy named Jim Novy. Okay. Jim Novy was Jewish, and he was a staunch believer in the whole issue of Zionism. Okay. I think he was actually Johnson's treasurer for his first failed Senate race. Okay.
Which suggests he had some connection to the finances behind LBJ from a very early day.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Also, his aunt was a member of a Zionist group. The very influential aunt was a member of a Zionist group. His father and his grandfather joined something called the Christ Philadelphia religion. This is a very strange and very rare religion that accents the priority of the Old Testament over the New Testament. Okay? In other words, the whole Messiah thing, in the Old Testament, whereas, the New Testament is more the life of Christ. All right? And so this is why he said to Jewish audiences, my religion comes from your religion. And that the Christ Philadelphians believed that when the Messiah came, he would be housed in Israel. All right. And so this is where, now, let me also add this.
Which would make it kind of an anti-Christian religion, right? I mean, I'm not.
Yes,
pretty straightforwardly. Christianity maintains that there was a Messiah and it was Jesus.
Yes.
So he's already.
Yeah. So it would be. You're exactly right. All right. Now let me add one other thing, and I don't think you can ignore this. Does anybody really believe that if the Crims did not have money, they would have the access they would to? No. LBJ, through his buddy Jim Novy, understood that there was a lot of money to be used in political campaigns, okay, through the Jewish community. All right. And this, of course, I believe was another angle for why he made such good friends and so many people in his. For example, there's Arthur Goldberg, who is ambassador to the UN.
Well, he was on the Supreme Court, and then he eventually steps down just before the 6-Day War, and he's this crazy Zionist who's now the UN ambassador.
Yeah,
and he's then later
he's defending Israel.
And fascinatingly, when they basically railroad Sprague for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Goldberg is approached to be carrying out that investigation, which is just fascinating.
He's one of the guys that they tried to go to, yes.
Right, which I think it is not a coincidence that they would go to this ardent Zionist person, because it's very strange.
Then,
as is his leaving right at that time, which to me says foreknowledge.
There's Abe Fortas, okay, who was another very good friend of Johnson's. Then there's the Rostows, okay, Walt Rostow and Eugene Rostow. Neither of these guys served in, what happened was Kennedy kicked Walt Rostow out of the White House, retired him over to the State Department, okay, because he thought he was too hawkish on Vietnam. Eugene Rostow was not even, I don't believe, was in Kennedy's administration. But both these guys, you know, Johnson made Walt Rostow National Security Advisor. I mean, Jesus, criminy. All right. And then
and these are the guys. Rostow was one of the Rostows was one of the people lobbying him to set up the Warren Commission as well.
That's Eugene Rostow.
Right.
Yeah. All right. They both served in his administration. Both of them very, very staunch backers, you know, of Israel. All right. And so Johnson was more or less, with all this stuff I'm filling in as background, you know, he was more or less predestined that this would happen. Now, if you take a look at his book, oh God, which the New York Times excerpted, he says that in relation to the Liberty incident, I think the number he puts it at, 10 killed, 34 wounded. And the New York Times actually printed this. And remember, this is 70, I think is 71, okay, which is 4 years after the Liberty incident. Well, the true figures were 34 dead, in other words, triple what Johnson quoted. And there were 174 wounded, all right, which is more than 4 times what Johnson quoted, all right. So this is Johnson, 4 years after the fact, is trying to downplay what really happened on board the Liberty incident on, I think it was June the 8th, 1967, you know, like 4 days after the outbreak of the 6-Day War. All right. Now, why Johnson, well, there's all kinds of reasons, I believe, why. Okay. There's, some people believe the Liberty incident is very difficult to explain.
Yeah, we could maybe do a whole down the road. Once you're done with the series, we don't have to go into detail about it today, but we should do a whole show on it later when you're done.
Let me say this. You know what the Israeli fallback story is, right?
There was a mistake or something, right?
They misidentified the Liberty for the Egyptian trawler Al-Qasir. Let me just say this. If you want to, you know, you want to have a good laugh, just take a look at the difference in size and weight between the two ships. The Al-Qasir is less than half the size. And here's the capper. The Al-Qasir wasn't even at sea that day. In other words, the Israelis didn't even make a good cover story. It was in port at that time. All right. So this whole idea that this was a mistake, I mean, this is a fairy tale. This was not a mistake. And to give Dean Rusk his due, he was the one guy in the Johnson cabinet, the Secretary of State, who never believed that this was a mistake, that this was a deliberate act. Okay. There you go. You got an hour out of me, Aaron.
Okay, that's cool. I do appreciate that. I would say another thing to think about with Johnson is you look at the position that he was in November of 1963, and that whole scandal that was going to be written up in Life magazine, you know, because RFK presumably was feeding information to people about the Bobby Baker scandal and so on, and that this really involved a guy, Henry Crown. Henry Crown is a super Zionist, and he was one of the people that J. Edgar Hoover told that reporter, the guy that wrote with Jack Anderson, I don't know why his name is escaping me right now. He's a famous reporter in Washington. Yeah, Pearson. Hoover told Pearson that the murder of James Reagan, the wire service guy, tracked back to Annenberg. You know, Walter Annenberg, whose father, Mo Annenberg, went to jail for schemes with Meyer Lansky. But the Annenbergs are huge Zionists, own the Philly Inquirer and TV Guide and the National Racing Wire, all that, right? And then Henry Crown was one of these people as well. And Crown was essentially the Chicago outfit. I mean, and a huge Zionist. If you fast forward to the 90s, there was a scandal of this group called the Mega Group, and it included Wexner, who was Epstein's patron, but also Lester Crown, attempting to, manipulate foreign policy and use their power and influence to, manipulate politics and stuff in the U.S. And then when when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, some Jewish voters and organizations were saying, we don't know about Obama, if we can trust this guy or whatever. The person that came forward to vouch for him was, I believe, Lester Crown. It was definitely one of the Crowns, and I think it was Lester Crown. So these are people who are still in power in the United States, and people who use their money to get away with all sorts of things. And it raises the question of, was Johnson, when you look at his treasurer and the fact that he became the wealthiest man in the Senate despite having a kind of humble background, was he kind of groomed in this sort of way from the beginning? Did he have these alliances? Were these alliances perhaps why he was able to have the rise that he had in politics to begin with? Because how do you get to be that rich and that powerful when you're such a shady individual?
These laws about contributions and things, they didn't exist back then. Okay. Yeah. There's a lot of ways you could disguise, bribery, and things like that. And the official story is that LBJ and his wife took a lot of money under the table to buy what ended up being a radio TV, a small empire, in Texas at that time. I think they owned about 7 or 8 radio and TV stations. All right. I think it was pretty much in her name so they could disguise the fact that he was the real owner. All right. But look, back then, before all these laws came in, you know how much Nixon was on the take? Come on. Yeah,
the Hughes loan, the loans from Hughes and things were very strange. Yeah, and they were almost used to booby trap his campaign later or something.
And the money that he got from the Shah of Iran, so he would say things like the Shah is a hallmark of democracy and liberty in the Middle East. Come on,
Yeah. Right.
Meanwhile, his Savak is torturing about 100 students, in these torture chambers that they have,
Yeah. I have come to believe, and this has been the most bizarre experience for me, having looked at the assassination so much, but that Peter Dale Scott's work on this dealt a lot more with Israel, and he had unpublished manuscripts that say things to this effect, that for whatever reason got rubbished by the publisher. One of them was about to come out, had been even written up in the Publisher's Weekly or something to this effect, right? And it just did not. They just didn't publish it for whatever reason.
It was canceled. Is that what you're saying?
It was. Everything was done for it except for it just didn't come out. And Max Arbo, our friend, found copies of these manuscripts, and he looked at them. And Peter says, at one point, he's looking at all of these connections with Jack Ruby and other Dallas figures to a certain pro-Israel elements, and he's saying, if Israel did play a considerable operational role in Dallas, as these things suggest, they wouldn't have done so without approval of a higher authority. And so, to make sense of this, I think that Angleton and the Israeli account and the Lansky group, and Lansky's mob, which is essentially, the old Murder Incorporated crew, but protected by the FBI and the FBN, and really in control of the international drug traffic, that they were likely used with the sanction on some level of military types. You have Jack Crichton in that car, in the motorcade, and then he's later there interviewing Marina Oswald. It's a very strange episode. But this would seem to explain a lot of the gaps in the record and so on, and it would explain how when Angleton was explaining why he used an Israeli agent to handle the Cuban business, He said it was because the Soviets had penetrated the CIA so much that he just had no other choice. But I don't really buy that. I think it is to cover up a lot of other very sinister things that are going on involving his alliances with syndicate figures and the protection of the drug traffic. And
Okay.
this, if you think about Jack Ruby and you look at some of the connections, like his own rabbi, for example, and then all the calls he was making to Vegas-linked figures and so on, and even Traficante and McWillie, they're subordinates of Lansky, then Jack Ruby is sort of in jail, and you can't investigate him even if you wanted to, because he tracks back to so many scandals that would be earth-shaking in terms of the U.S. collaboration with drug traffickers and so on. It would, like, this seems to be a part of the assassination. And you said that, and I never heard this before, and I'd love to know if you have anything else to say on it, but that at one point Jim Garrison said it was military intelligence, CIA, and the Lansky segment of the syndicate that were behind the assassination.
In 1975, there was a cover story in New Orleans Magazine. This was during the church committee. And there was a story of an interview with Garrison. And that is what he said. That was one of the big takeaways from that article.
Right. That's just fascinating. I don't know if he ever expounded. You read his different memoirs on this. I think you wrote two, right? Heritage of Stone, and then On the Trail of the Assassins, or something like that.
On the Trail of the Assassins, yes.
Yeah. So, but does he mention that very much in either of those, or was that?
I don't recall if he did or not. Okay, off the top of my head, but that is where I got that quote from New Orleans Magazine.
Yeah. Because that to me seems so kind of on the money, but it's it's just I don't know what to make of what Garrison actually thought about it, because he one of the criticisms of him from people like Sheridan and Peter is that he and Russell Long had all of these Teamster Hoffa connections in some way, and I don't find what Peter has said about that to be totally coherent. But I also find it the more that I think about how corrupt New Orleans in particular was, but in general, the Democratic South was, and that New Orleans was one of these places where, going back to Huey Long, that was one of the original Lansky outposts in the U.S. was in Louisiana, and Huey Long was a part of this. That it was so corrupt there that you couldn't really be the district attorney of New Orleans without having some sense of what you could and couldn't do in terms of messing with politically powerful people who often were connected to Teamster type corruption. Have done a lot of work on it.
I have to say that these articles that I've written on Substack, all right, they have tripled the traffic going to my Substack site in the last month. Okay. And they've also, in addition to that, they've also caused a lot of discussion, etc. So yeah, I agree with you. There seems, I chalk this up to what's going on over there. Okay, I think any person, who has any kind of fairness or objectivity has agreed that, that this has really gone too far. And the fact that Trump bent over and went along with that bombing, of Iran was really the kind of salt in the collective unconscious wound, of America over this issue. See, for whatever reason, Israel's completely blown the stature and the affection that she used to have, in America. And I believe that, Benjamin Netanyahu is a big reason why. And one last point before I leave. One can argue that This is all because he's trying to avoid these charges that are weighing against him. Okay? Because it's a pretty strong case against him. All right? And he's doing this out of a personal avenue to avoid these charges. That's what a lot of his fiercest critics, in Israel are charging about him. Okay.
Right.
Thank you so much, Aaron.
All right, Jim. Thank you very much. I will, whenever those articles, maybe I'll reach out to you again when your Liberty articles are done, and we could do a bigger discussion over that because it's such a crazy episode. But anyway, thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. I want to express my deepest appreciation to all of our American Exception subscribers. If you are not a subscriber, please consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Thank you for tuning in and helping us bring light to the devil's chessboard.